Camping, where we discuss things that you might have not realized were going on. In our World War II series, we will be discussing the Battle of Okinawa. But first, where is Okinawa?
As we can see in our map of the Eastern world, we can identify Japan. However, we can barely identify the largest island of the Ryukyu Islands, the island of Okinawa, which has been ravaged by both the nations of Japan and China throughout the ages. The island folk were always a very non-aggressive people who just wanted to live in peace. For centuries, the Okinawans jockeyed themselves between China and Japan, paying tribute when necessary to maintain their relative independence. In 1871, Okinawa finally came under control of Japan and remained so until World War II. During World War II, when many Okinawans still spoke a different dialect, Japanese troops treated their locals brutally. During the Battle of Okinawa, which 1/4 of the civilian population was killed, the Japanese army showed indifference to Okinawa's defense and safety. Japanese soldiers used civilians as shields against the Americans, and persuaded locals that victorious American soldiers would go on a rampage of killing and raping. With the impending victory of American troops, civilians committed mass suicide urged by fanatical Japanese soldiers. Those who did not commit suicide hid in caves which they were subsequently entombed.
Now, the Battle of Okinawa was one of the most devastating battles World War II had to offer, if not the most devastating. It lasted from April 1st to July 2nd.
The battle proceeded in 4 phases. First, the advance of the eastern coast. Second, the clearing of the northern part of the island. Third, the occupation of the outlying islands. And fourth, the main battle against the dug-in elements. More ships were used, more troops put ashore, more supplies transported, more bombs dropped, more naval guns fired against shore targets than any other operation in the Pacific. More people died during the Battle of Okinawa than all those killed during the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Casualties totaled more than 38,000 Americans wounded and 12,000 killed or missing. 34 of Allied troops and crafts of all types had been sunk, mostly by kamikazes, and 368 ships and craft damaged. American losses at Okinawa were so heavy as to elicit the Congress calls for an investigation into the conduct of the military commanders. Not surprisingly, the cost of this battle, in terms of lives, time, and material, weighed heavily in the decision to use the atomic bomb against Japan 6 weeks later. Japanese human losses were enormous: 107 and 500,000 soldiers killed, and 23,764 sealed in caves or buried by the Japanese themselves. By the end of May, monsoon rains, which turned contested slopes and roads into morass, exuberated both the tactical and medical situations. The ground advance began to resemble a World War I battlefield as troops began mired in mud. Flooded roads greatly inhibited evacuation of wounded to the rear. Troops lived on a field sodden by rain, part garbage dump and part graveyard. Unburied Japanese bodies decayed, sank in the mud, and became part of a noxious stew. Anyone sliding down the greasy slopes could easily find their pockets full of maggots by the end of the journey. American losses mounted as soldiers and Marines assaulted points on the Shuri Line with the deceptive names of Sugarloaf, Chocolate Drop, Chronicle Hill, Strawberry Hill, and Sugar Hill.
But what exactly is a kamikaze? Now, if we look back on history, we shall find that kamikaze for the Japanese meant wind of the gods. Now, the Japanese believed that this wind would drive away their enemies, such as the Mongols. In their own twisted way, they created their own wind and drove away their opponents. Now, a kamikaze attack, which you probably know from Pearl Harbor and other kamikaze attacks, usually consists of a boat and a plane. Now, the plane containing the driver flies in, destroys boat, kills people, destroys plane, kills pilot.
Recruiting the kamikaze was surprisingly easy for the Japanese. Many of the Japanese young males viewed being a kamikaze as sort of like being a samurai, and they would use the same conduct of code by sacrificing their life for the people. But what happened to Okinawa after the war? The Potsdam Conference dictated that the United States would have occupation of Okinawa, as well as South Korea and the Anami Islands.
Well, that about wraps it up. Thank you for tuning in. I am Stacy Goodwood, and please tune in next week for In Case You Were Not